Some events don't just make the news. They actually manage to awaken the conscience of an entire nation. Today, we're going to talk about one of those moments, the Nirbhaya case. It's a story of incredible tragedy, but also one of unimaginable fury and a fight for change that was heard all around the world. Let's get into how this one case shook a country to its very core.
So here's the thing. We're not going to start with the crime itself. We're going to start with what happened after, because the reaction, well, that's where you really start to understand the true scale of this story.
Picture this. It's the winter of 2012, and the streets across India are just flooded with people. I'm talking New Delhi, Kolkata, Bangalore, everywhere. People from all walks of life holding candles, holding signs, their voices all coming together in this one unified roar of absolute outrage. This was so much more than a protest. It was like a societal earthquake.
So you have to ask yourself, what could possibly trigger a reaction on this scale? What single event could bring a whole country to a standstill, with everyone demanding justice and vowing never again? To get that, we need to go back.
Okay, so to answer that question, we have to look at the event that lit the fuse. And I'll be honest, the details are tough to hear, but they're absolutely essential to understanding why the nation responded the way it did. It all started with something so incredibly normal. A 23-year-old physiotherapy intern and her friend, they were just heading home after seeing a movie. They hopped on what they thought was a regular public bus. It wasn't.
What happened in that bus was an act of just unimaginable cruelty. Both the young woman and her friend were viciously attacked. The 6 men on the bus gang-raped her, and the assault itself was done with such extreme brutality that it caused catastrophic internal injuries. When they were done, they stripped them both and threw them out of the moving bus, just leaving them for dead on the side of the road.
So, in India, the law protects the identity of sexual assault victims, which means you can't use their real name. Instead, the media and the public gave her a name that really captured her spirit and her fight. Nirbhaya. It means the fearless one. And that name, it's become this powerful symbol for resilience and the demand for justice. For 13 long days, she fought for her life. First in Delhi, and then they flew her to a specialized hospital in Singapore. But her injuries, they were just too severe. On December 29th, she passed away. And when that news broke, the entire nation's grief just transformed into this unstoppable demand for action. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. You had this fight happening out on the streets, with everyday citizens demanding huge systemic change. And at the same time, another fight was just getting started inside the courtroom. Now, to really get why people were so angry, you need some context. This wasn't some isolated incident. At that time, Delhi had the horrible distinction of having the highest rate of sexual crimes among India's big cities. A rape was being reported almost every 18 hours. Think about that. So Nirbhaya's case, it wasn't just about one awful crime. It was the final straw for a society that was completely fed up with the constant threat of violence against women.
And look, this wasn't just a Delhi thing. Not at all. The anger was felt everywhere. The protests weren't just in the capital. That call for justice echoed across the entire country. It was this unified, public demand for safety and accountability that leaders just couldn't ignore anymore.
Now, the legal journey, wow, it was long and messy. From the first arrest right after the crime in December 2012, it took over 7 years for everything to play out. The main accused actually died in jail, but finally in September 2013, the 4 other adult convicts were sentenced to death, and that sentence, it was eventually carried out in March of 2020.
But here's where things got really complicated and controversial. Of the 6 attackers, one of them was a minor. He was just a few months shy of his 18th birthday. So while the adults faced the death penalty, he was given the maximum sentence allowed under the juvenile law at the time, just 3 years in a reform facility. And that outcome, as you can imagine, sparked a massive, fierce debate across India about juvenile justice.
But all that noise, all that public pressure, it did a lot more than just get a verdict in court. It forced the entire system to take a long, hard look in the mirror, and it led to real, concrete changes in the law and in society.
The government actually responded pretty quickly, and they did it in a few key ways. First, they set up something called the Justice Verma Committee to completely overhaul the laws around sexual assault. Then, based on what that committee recommended, Parliament passed much tougher legislation. They expanded the definition of rape and brought in stricter punishments, even the death penalty in the most extreme cases. And third, they created the Nirbhaya Fund to finance projects specifically aimed at protecting women.
And that wasn't all. A whole wave of other initiatives came out of this. New commissions were created to figure out where security had failed. Brand new 24-hour helplines for women were launched, both at the national and local level. Rules were put in place for mandatory GPS tracking in public transport. They even named a new government building Nirbhaya Bhavan in her honor, really cementing her legacy into the institutions of the state itself.
So, after the protests died down and the court cases were finally over, what was left? What is the real, lasting legacy of this case?
You know, one Indian newspaper really summed it up perfectly. They just said, "A brave girl changed the system." And it's true. The fight for justice in her name fundamentally changed the country's laws and its entire social fabric.
And those candlelight vigils, they became so much more than just a way to grieve. They really represented a collective promise, a public vow to always remember Nirbhaya and to keep fighting for a society where women can finally feel safe.
But maybe the biggest change of all wasn't in the law books. This case shattered the silence that had surrounded sexual violence in India for so long. It gave countless women the courage to come forward, to report crimes, and to demand to be heard. It took the issue of women's safety from the sidelines and put it right at the center of the national conversation.
So the convicts were executed, new laws were written, funds were created, justice was delivered, right? But the ultimate question remains, and it's one for all of us to think about. Has the promise of a safer India, a promise born from this terrible tragedy, has it truly been fulfilled? The conversation that Nirbhaya started, it's far from over.